come to our country and execute these attacks on innocent people.
The explosion has just occurred. Everyone is running from the entire financial district now. The smoke is filling the entire area. Let's go! Go, Brad, go! Stop shooting, Brad, go!
I wanted to stand up for my nation. I was going to give my all. I said, okay, I'm going to war.
New York, September 11th, 2001. Two planes have just crashed into the Twin Towers and chaos reigns over the scene. Thousands of civilians have lost their lives and the entire country is plunged into confusion and anger. Soon, the group Al-Qaeda is identified as the person responsible for the horror. The terrorists have dared to attack the United States on its own territory, not knowing that the response would be brutal. Washington is quick to plan Operation Enduring Freedom, a large-scale invasion that not only involves a massive deployment of troops, but also a campaign of air assaults and ground operations in the hostile, mountainous environment of Afghanistan. Each confrontation turns into a fierce battle, characterized by the resistance of the Taliban and the intense bombing of Uncle Sam's forces. In this new video from Military Force, we invite you to learn all about these savage battles. A war like no other, where only one word lives in the minds of Americans: revenge. American forces were determined to go after the Al-Qaeda and Taliban insurgents who held sway in Afghanistan. Over the last century, a bitter civil war had made the country an ideal place for terrorist groups to take refuge. That's how Osama bin Laden managed to plan the brutal attack on the Twin Towers, an event that shook the entire world. The United States knew that fighting on that difficult and remote battlefield meant an enormous challenge. However, it quickly found a positive response from the soldiers. They were all ready to fight for their nation after the attacks. The cruel attack had inspired tens of thousands of uniformed men who requested to be part of the force that would travel to the inhospitable enemy territory. And so a lethal revenge was set in motion almost immediately.
Less than a month after 9/11, the U.S. goes on the offensive. The mission? Destroy Al-Qaeda training camps, bomb Taliban military installations, and hunt down Osama bin Laden.
The military intervention not only promised to eliminate the perpetrators of the attack, but also aimed to restore security to Americans and send a clear message. Whoever dared to attack the country would have to pay the consequences. On October 7, 2001, the first American planes began bombing strategic points in Afghanistan to achieve their goals. The airstrikes sought to decimate the rival infrastructure and prevent the growth of bin Laden's followers. The attacks had made him a hero for all of Washington's enemies, and eliminating him was vital to completing the plan. However, it would not be an easy task. The American forces had the support of Great Britain. However, they also formed a coalition with a group of Afghan fighters who resisted the Taliban regime. They called it the Northern Alliance. Thanks to this, they were able to land in the country and learn more about their adversaries, since this militia had been waging its own war for the nation's freedom for years. With his help, Uncle Sam's revenge became the nightmare of bloodthirsty terrorists.
Justice will be done.
Unleashing its wrath, America, with the help from Britain, has struck at Taliban targets and terrorist training camps across Afghanistan.
The first stage was already underway. It was time to move on to the second phase, advancing towards the capital, Kabul. From there, the most violent fighting of the war began, starting with the terrible Battle of Mazar-e Sharif. for the eyes of the world were on that city, located in the heart of northern Afghanistan. It had immense strategic value, since controlling it would open the doors to the rest of the territory. This would be the first test of fire for the United States and its allies, who until now had simply watched the destruction from the cockpits of planes, dropping bombs that reduced their rivals' bastions to ashes. Although this strategy also began in the air, this time it had to be coordinated with the advance of infantry on the ground. The American forces were ready to unleash all their fury and take another step towards the annihilation of the enemy.
American B-52 bombers pound nearby enemy targets.
The Taliban really didn't know what to do because we showed up in their backyards. We can't believe it. It was just so quick that they collapsed and began falling back.
The airstrikes raised a cloud of dust that mixed with the fire from burning buildings. Terror gripped the Taliban troops entrenched in Mazar-e-Sharif, who had not expected the precision bombing. Bewildered when the blanket of earth and smoke began to dissipate, they could clearly see their rivals who were advancing towards them at full speed. The Afghan warriors rode on horseback, like an ancestral spectacle that seemed to come from another era. Next to them, the elite American soldiers accompanied them with cutting-edge technology and lethal weapons. The insurgents tried to take their defensive positions in the midst of desperation. But when they least expected it, a new attack with guided bombs blew them up. The ground shook with each impact, generating a spectacle of fire that illuminated the desolation of the desert. Thus began the American offensive, which continued with the same violence during the following hours. The first days were a bloodbath. The Taliban were not prepared to surrender the city without a fight to the last breath, but despite the support of a handful of al-Qaeda fighters, the US forces continued to ravage everything. Mazar-e-Sharif was a hell, with huge craters everywhere and screams of pain from each warrior who fell wounded. The rifles and machine guns of the Northern Alliance never stopped. The bursts of gunfire were constant, and enemy corpses piled up by the hundreds. The survivors, seeing themselves overwhelmed by the enemy fire, responded with desperation and violence. They ambushed the Americans with landmines and even began to carry out suicide attacks. These brutal sacrifices were the way the ferocious enemy had found to annihilate an army that was overtaking it. However, the resistance was implacable. After several days, the enemy could not bear it any longer, and the city fell. But that was not the end of the brutality in Mazar-e-Sharif. One of the flashpoints of the fighting was at the Kala-e-Jangi fortress, an ancient citadel that had been taken over by US troops to hold hundreds of Taliban fighters captured during the fighting. However, what was meant to be a simple containment mission turned into a nightmare when the inmates rioted. With inhuman fury, they attacked the guards who were watching over them, managing to snatch weapons and ammunition. Within minutes, the interior of the fortress became a battlefield. The riot spread like wildfire. American soldiers were surrounded and bullets began to fly in all directions. The Taliban prisoners, armed and out of control, charged forward with great ferocity, willing to die rather than surrender. The Kala-e-Jangi confrontation left a trail of death and devastation, and attempts at containment escalated to unspeakable levels of brutality. Faced with the critical situation, the American forces made the decision to attack with all their might. Bomber planes and helicopter gunships rained fire on the fortress. The roar of the explosions shook the stone walls while the sky darkened under a thick cloud of smoke. The massacre lasted for days, and in the end, few prisoners survived.
It takes 6 days for US and Afghan soldiers to put down the uprising. Just 2 months into the war, and the US has driven the enemy from their urban strongholds and toppled the Taliban regime.
We did it faster than I would have thought. Those young men on the A-teams just did a spectacular job.
American troops celebrated victory, but not for long. They needed to continue advancing towards their main objective in the capital. However, before Kabul there was another stop. Kunduz. This was another of the Taliban's great strongholds in the north. A strategic bastion surrounded by hills that offered a natural defense full of fighters. Thousands of insurgents, many of them loyal to Al-Qaeda, knew that the enemy had triumphed in Mazar-i-Sharif and were waiting for it, eager to take revenge. Every corner of the city was prepared for battle. In every corner, a deadly trap was ready to explode when the rival forces arrived. On the opposite side, Americans and Afghans planned their attack to take the last Taliban refuge in their path. They were aware that the enemy would be waiting for them, so the element of surprise was not an option. The best alternative was to descend upon them with a firestorm, and to achieve this, they prepared the most deadly weapons in their arsenal. Finally, the time for action arrived. The assault began again with an air offensive that turned the ground into a hell of rubble and fire.
Their target is a safe house, sheltering over 200 Taliban fighters.
Roger, 800 meters to the northeast of violet smoke. We need gun runs on those structures. Copy.
A huge ball of fire and smoke rose into the air. The attack had been carried out, eliminating the threat in an instant. As the Northern Alliance troops advanced on Kunduz, the brutality of the battle increased. The Taliban, armed to the teeth, had prepared a labyrinth of defenses with snipers in every building and mines buried in the access routes. The resistance was savage, and the battlefield was quickly covered in blood. It was not just a struggle for military power, but a display of ferocity that left no room for doubt. Whoever did not kill, died. The insurgents knew that this was their last stand in the region, and they faced the enemy soldiers without fear, resorting once again to suicide attacks that enveloped the city in a storm of bullets and shrapnel. Hand-to-hand combat became a constant for several days, which soon turned into weeks. Guns and knives mingled in a choreography of death and despair. Casualties mounted with every hour, and the situation inside Kunduz became untenable. The Taliban army knew there was no future for them if Kunduz fell, so their every move was a wild cry of resistance. The fighting intensified at night, when shadows and cold covered the battlefield, and exhausted soldiers tried to advance under relentless enemy fire. As the fighting became blow by blow, the Americans and their Afghan allies decided to surround the city and cut off all avenues of escape. Out of supplies and totally trapped, the insurgent fire slowly died down. The massacre seemed to be over. Kunduz had become an improvised cemetery, with the bodies of fallen fighters everywhere. But they were not the only victims. In the Americans' quest to wipe out the terrorists, a huge number of innocent people were killed amid the bombings and ferocious attacks. Days of mourning accompanied the operation, and the collateral damage only served to deepen hatred towards the West. The remaining Taliban warriors tried to flee as a last resort, but were intercepted and taken to facilities that were used as prisons. Locked up, overcrowded, and hungry, hell continued to burn for them. Thus, one of the darkest chapters of the war would come to an end. Due to the desire to wipe out any enemy rearguard, the Americans and their partners applied extreme measures, executing many prisoners in cold blood and leaving others to die in inhumane conditions. The battle had reached a new level of brutality, but Osama bin Laden was still free. After wiping out the Taliban forces, it was time to go after the most wanted man. The al-Qaeda leader was among hundreds of other fighters who had regrouped near the Pakistani border. That trail led them to Tora Bora, a remote corner of Afghanistan where the war would continue to rage.
It was so intense. What the heck is going on? And I can remember one of my staff sergeants said, "What is that noise?" I said, "It's an AK-47. It makes a distinct sound."
Where's that fire coming from?
It was a dogfight. We were almost eyeball to eyeball.
This mountainous region, full of tunnels and caves, had been a hideout for terrorists for years. They hoped that, sheltered from the freezing heights, they could hold out to the end. But they had not counted on the enormous American sense of revenge. From the beginning, the mission in Tora Bora was clear but terrifying. The US troops were aware that they would enter one of the most difficult terrains in the country. Enemy fighters could hide and move unseen, and the lack of access routes made any advance a deadly odyssey. Air power again became the main ally of the attackers, who began their offensive with a bombing that destroyed the mountain hideouts. For days, the sky was furrowed by explosions and fire. Missiles rained down from above, piercing the caves and devastating every corner. Despite this, the insurgents did not surrender. Bin Laden and his followers were prepared to fight to the death, hiding deep in the ground and taking advantage of every nook and cranny. The Taliban and al-Qaeda members launched sporadic attacks and ambushes that trapped the rival forces, who were fighting in completely unfamiliar terrain. Although intelligence reports said the man they were looking for was there, finding him in the labyrinth of tunnels was like trying to hunt a ghost in the dark. After several days of fighting and minimal progress, patience ran out. The Americans intensified their bombing and closed every passage they found. They had Osama bin Laden in their clutches, or so they thought. But then, the impossible happened. The terrorist leader managed to escape into the mountains of Pakistan. No one knew how it could have happened, but the main objective of the mission had been lost. Beyond the hard blow it meant in Washington, they celebrated the fall of the Taliban regime as a victory.
Across the world, we're hunting down the killers, one by one. We are winning.
The American presence had been overwhelming. As a result of these bloody battles, it had eliminated nearly 30,000 Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters. The fighting was constant and savage, but eventually the American troops managed to prevail and maintain control of the country. Moreover, after an exhaustive search on May 2, 2011, an elite team of the Marines finally located Osama bin Laden. He was in a safe house in Abbottabad, Pakistan, where Uncle Sam's forces carried out a surgical and lethal raid. They entered and managed to eliminate all the al-Qaeda fighters until they reached their leader. When he tried to raise his rifle to attack, he was mercilessly killed. This was a moment of relief and celebration for many in the West, even though the war showed no signs of stopping. The insurgents continued their offensive, and each year civilian casualties increased, as did losses among the armies. By 2014, the United States began to gradually withdraw its men, delegating security responsibility to the Afghan army, whom it had trained and equipped with weapons. That was the end of Operation Enduring Freedom, a savage response to the deadly attack of September 11, 2001, which left an indelible mark of fear and death in history. And now, after having learned about the brutal American invasion of Afghanistan, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to seeing you in our next military force video.